So we can start. It's time. So welcome to everyone to this parallel session. Happy to be here. I'm Maria Impedovo. I'm just a brief introduction about myself, and sorry for sometimes for my English. So I'm a researcher here in Marseille, but actually in Italy now. So welcome to Claire, Jack, Andy, and Aidan. Aidan, yes, it's here. So for this presentation, we will move from one presentation to the next and take question at the end. So put any question in the question and answer Zoom in chat. And if appropriate, identify the contributor to the question is aimed at. So we move now in the first presentation of Claire. Welcome, Claire. If I'm not wrong, Claire is PhD candidate, and she will talk about classes stand-up comedy. Welcome, Claire. If we have a PowerPoint to share.
Yeah, I can get started. Brilliant. So good morning, everyone. For those of us that I saw in the chat that are joining us from Canada, good very early morning, and thank you for waking up at 3:30 to be here. I'm not sure that I have that commitment. So the presentation today, I'm going to look at stand-up comedians and working class culture. It's actually based on a project that's post PhD. So my PhD is on something quite different. My PhD is on feminist media and representations of feminism. So it's quite a shift away from that, but it was funded by the British Academy at Leverhulme last year, and it's on the cultural economy of comedy, specifically in the East Midlands. And it was really important that I got funding, not necessarily just for the obvious reasons that you can go to conferences, you can do all of that stuff, but mostly because it meant that I could actually make sure that my participants were compensated for the time that they spent talking to me. It's one of the things that often we find within academia is that we ask a lot from participants when we're doing our research, but we don't necessarily take into account that, especially for my participants who are often self-employed, that time they could be spending that time doing something paid. So that was a really important part of it for me. So it was a 2-year project. Well, it is a 2-year project. It began in May 2020, which is quite frankly the worst possible time to start a research project around anything, given that we were in the middle of the first lockdown. But you know, there we go. And the aim was to speak to at least 10 interviewees 3 times. I've spoken to 9 at the minute, and I've done 2 interviews with 4 of them. So I've done some follow-up interviews with some of my participants. I will say that although I'm looking at comedy, I'm not particularly funny in the context of this presentation. So you might need to lower your expectations if you're expecting many laughs, because a lot of what I'm saying is not particularly funny. But here we go. So the research questions then, I wanted to look at how comedians in the East Midlands manage a career in comedy. What are the challenges to working in comedy specifically in the East Midlands? How do comedians in the East Midlands support themselves financially? And can they sustain comedy through, can they sustain themselves through comedy alone? So can we think of it as a career? And if it's not a career, what kind of other things are people doing alongside that? And how is that also kind of impacted by class positions? So obviously if you are kind of working in an office 9 to 5, your ability to do things outside of that is much different from someone that's doing shift work in a warehouse where they potentially have got 12-hour shifts that they've got very little kind of freedom to change. And what I really wanted to look at is how class, gender and race impact on the ability to develop a comedy career. And I think it's important at this point as well to think about these 3 things as intersecting with each other, so they don't exist as kind of singular kind of dimensions. I think that's particularly important when we talk about kind of class in the British context, because we've seen in the last couple of months in particular this real attempt, especially by the kind of the Conservative government, to kind of a real divide and rule thing where we kind of put race class kind of in opposition to each other, but obviously that ignores the kind of intersections between them and the fact that for kind of working class comedians that are kind of that are people of colour, then there are additional kind of dimensions that they need to consider. And again, that's the same with gender. So the experience of a working class woman in the industry is different from the experience of a working class man because of kind of the gender dynamics as well. So I just wanted to kind of make that really clear that we need to kind of think of these as an intersectional issue and not think of them as kind of separate from each other. So I wanted to start off with just kind of thinking about COVID, because I think obviously that feels inevitable. It's had a massive impact in terms of the research. So I moved from the original intention of having interviews done in person, where I would meet them and we would chat in person, to having interviews being done exclusively online since COVID. I think that's quite an interesting thing to consider, given that that's the way the industry's had to change as well. So a lot of the people that I've been interviewing have only been able to do online performances in the past kind of 16 months or so. So it's interesting to think how that kind of interacts with their discussions with me, where we're doing things that we would have normally done in person as well. Questions mean something very different now. So often I will be talking about, when did you last gig? Where do you gig? How often do you gig? All of these are questions that mean something quite different in the context of COVID. So I think that's another thing to kind of bear in mind as well. My interview schedule has gone completely out of the window. So originally I was interviewing around some key events, so around the Leicester Comedy Festival, which happens in February every year, which did happen this year, but it was all online, and around the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which usually happens in August, which didn't happen at all last year, and is happening this year in a much reduced form. Obviously, with those events not happening, it became less important to interview people around those periods of time, but it also meant that some of those kind of key moments in the year meant something quite different. And also there is an ethical implication that I think I've been really conscious and really keenly aware of, which is at a time of great uncertainty, how much can you ask, especially when you're talking about precarity, especially when you're talking about, people that have lost their income and have lost something that's very important to them. I think there is kind of a real fine line between, on the one hand, wanting to document this period of time, whilst on the other hand, wanting to acknowledge the fact that people are going through a lot of kind of, a lot of emotional kind of, and in some cases trauma, and not wanting to kind of impinge on that. And so in the first interviews that I did with participants, I was really clear that we weren't really going to explicitly talk about the impact of the pandemic, in partly because a lot of the things that I talk about are not exclusive to COVID. These issues were happening pre-COVID, so I think it's important to recognise that, but also because, it felt a little bit too fresh to be kind of probing people on on those changes. But in some of my follow-ups, I have talked a bit more explicitly about that, because I felt that I had a better relationship with my participants because we'd already spoken to each other, so we weren't strangers, and also enough time had passed since the kind of since March 2020 that it felt a little bit more easy to kind of have those conversations. So just for those that don't know then, in terms of structure of comedy, I'll go through this really quickly. So obviously you see the people on the TV, but to get to that point, you usually started off at the beginning doing an open 10 or even an open 5, which is usually where beginners start. It's pretty much always exclusively unpaid, and it's quite rare that you even get paid expenses for it. So often you're kind of paying to be there. You have your opener or your headliner, and these are usually for more established acts, and these are usually paid, and usually you pay close more than your opener. You've got your MC and your compare, and these are the people that kind of keep everything together. So if you think about today, Maria would be the comedy equivalent would be an MC of Maria in her role as chair. You have a bucket split, which often you see at things like the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, where people will do a show for free, but they will have a bucket at the end that they'll shake, and then you put donations in. And then you have things like gong shows, which is a competition with cash prize. And that's usually the case where you've guaranteed 5 minutes. And then if the crowd doesn't like you will get gonged off the stage. So someone will literally tell you to go away. And so there's quite a lot of interesting conversation around the competitive nature of those kind of shows. And the industry is very competitive and very individualistic in a lot of ways. Then you have things like Proline, up to places like the Comedy Score and the Glee clubs that we have across the country. So that kind of gives you an idea, and as you can see that you're not going to get paid for a very long time. if at all. And I think that has an impact in terms of who can access the industry and who can't. So there's been a lot of debates around class and comedy. So the precarious nature of the industry, the kind of emphasis on low or no pay. And we can put this in the context of conversations that have been happening elsewhere within the creative and cultural industries around this in kind of the past decade or so. So recently, for example, Michael Sheen talks about kind of, you know, the experience of working class actors. There's been recent books such as Culture is Bad for You by Dave O'Brien, Matt Taylor and Orion Brooke, which again has kind of done a lot of brilliant work on kind of looking at the experiences of inequality within the cultural industries, and the fact that we can't just say that culture isn't necessarily a good thing when access to culture, both as kind of consumers and participants and also as producers, is often so kind of unequal. There's been a huge amount of discussion around the Edinburgh Festival. So to go to Edinburgh, you can pay to go to Edinburgh as a participant, so to take a show up there as a comedian, which is probably the cheapest way to do it because you don't have any kit. You might have a director, you might have kind of like a small amount of tech, but compared to a theatre show, it's not that kind of, you know, it's not, it's quite low maintenance. You might spend £8,000 to £10,000 taking a show up. And obviously we can think about how for comedians, working class comedians, that is often prohibitive. And also it means you've got to take a whole month off, which again, for those that are working in kind of, you know, jobs where you might have 20 days of holiday for a whole year, that's not necessarily feasible. And that wouldn't be an issue if it wasn't for the fact that Edinburgh is kind of positioned as kind of a key way to get known as a comedian. Often the television festival happens at the same time, so you've got a lot of television commissioners that are there at the same time. So again, we've got to think about how, you know, access to these spaces is limited based on reasons that are not really to do with talent and more to do with kind of financial means. And obviously there's been lots of discussions around COVID and its impact on comedians in the industry as well. So I just wanted to kind of break at this point and talk about some good things that kind of are happening before I move on to look at some more kind of challenges. So Guz Khan, who created Man Like We've Been, which is on BBC Three, has launched a trainee scheme, which is intended to encourage more working class participation. And I think that kind of highlights one of the key issues, which is often one of the problems for kind of working class comedians and also those that want to work in production, is that it's incredibly difficult to even get in at the bottom. So, you know, to even get in at the point of traineeships, often it relies on kind of a network of people that you know, and often, you know, working class voices are left out of that. So I wanted to kind of highlight that as a good thing that's happening and something that we can maybe think about if that's the way to kind of develop things in the future. But the flip side of that is we get things like the Manchester Comedy Club, the Frog and Bucket. They applied for funding from the Cultural Recovery Fund, and they were kind of described as being not culturally significant. The Frog and Bucket have got a huge role in kind of new talent, especially from the Northwest, come through the Frog and Bucket. A lot of household names that you see today started off there. So we can think about how comedy is often seen as kind of slightly othered in terms of culture. It's not seen as kind of legitimate in comparison to other forms of culture. And this, I think, is a good example of that. So obviously we can see a lot of the cultural significance of the Frog and Bucket as a comedy club, but it's kind of seen as not culturally significant. And that kind of is also seen in the fact that the Arts Council won't fund comedy. They don't see it as an art form. So again, you know, the kind of funding that's there for other kind of arts isn't there, which I think we can link that to the fact that comedy comes predominantly from kind of working class roots. So for working class comedians, it's kind of there's a double-edged kind of issue there. So on the one hand, it's not seen as culturally significant, so it's not given funding. On the other hand, it costs a lot to be within the industry. So it makes it, you know, that much more difficult. So the Live Comedy Association, which started off last year in response to the pandemic, they did an emergency survey and they found that, and all of these are kind of coming from 2020, where we expected the kind of lockdown to finish before it has. We didn't necessarily expect a third lockdown. So they found that a third of comedy venues believe they're forced to close in the next 6 months, 77% facing closure within the next year. 45% of respondents have given serious thought to leaving comedy because of the pandemic, and 6% of respondents predicting they'll need to leave before February 2021, unless we're able to get back to performances, which, as we know now, they weren't. 83% of performers don't think, promoters don't think they'll run all their regular events, and 75% of performers estimated that they've earned less than 5% of their pre-pandemic estimated income from online performances. And then 73% found that their mental health negatively impacted by job and industry uncertainty during the pandemic. So we can see how, I think, one of the risks is that an already kind of quite difficult environment for kind of working class comedians is going to be made worse by the kind of shrinking of the industry, and the fact that, you know, if we're being realistic, the people that are going to be able to hold on longest are the ones that have kind of other forms of income, and for working class comedians that's not always possible. And again, this is not a new thing. So in 2019, Nika Burns, who is the boss of the Edinburgh Comedy Awards, she challenged the idea that the fringe workers should be fighting for better working conditions by suggesting that it would kind of somehow ruin the spirit of the fringe. I think this is important because I think it kind of shows how often the industry is set up as being somehow kind of idealistic, and that you should just be in it because you love comedy or you love kind of, you know, you love performing. But obviously for those from working class backgrounds, you can't perform at all if you don't have the money to get there, and you can't work at the fringe if you literally can't afford to be there. So some interesting things I thought, you know, that she said, which I would strongly challenge. So performers, it offers incredible career opportunities for everyone. It's not just a temporary summer job. I know many people with successful careers in entertainment who started here working in front of house on street teams, really mucking in. It's life-changing experience. Should that opportunity to participate be eroded away or taken away through restriction and limitation? No, it's a month of celebration. It's a festival, a celebration. It's insane and marvellous. Then we all go back to the real world to study, to work, less hours, better pay, better conditions, but not half as much fun. Where in the UK can you just get up and do it? So yes to entrepreneurship. And again, we can see how this is being framed as you kind of go and you kind of know that you're not going to get paid very much, but it's so fun. But again, that kind of suggests a level of stability in terms of kind of, you know, finance that means that you can even do that in the first place. And the fact that we have performers that are literally camping for a whole month because they can't afford to stay in Edinburgh because accommodation prices are so expensive. You know, we have people that go into thousands and thousands of pounds of credit card debt to be there. Suggests that for some people it's easier to kind of accept it as kind of a, you know, period of fun than it is for others. So there are things like the Fair Fringe, which was set up, as I say, for a fair deal for fringe workers, which again suggests the fact that there is some momentum in kind of changing things. And obviously the fringe is going to look very different this year and possibly next year as well, which I think will also have an impact because pre-pandemic it was, you know, it was increasingly growing bigger and bigger, and there was a very clear kind of risk of kind of it being a bit of a bubble that was going to burst. So it'll be really interesting to see what the impact of the pandemic is on that. So findings from the research that I've done so far. So the expectation really is that you're going to lose money gigging. Comedy is a lot of admin unless you have an agent. And there's limitation of festivals in kind of bringing benefit year round. The financial risk is mainly on performers. So you will lose money to make money, but only if you're lucky. And like a lot of cultural industries, it's very opaque. It's unclear how to access some opportunities. So very much it's, you know, who you know. And obviously you can see how that has an impact on, you know, some performers. And you can think about how, you know, some of the biggest comedians we have in the UK come from particular universities, such as Cambridge and the Footlights. Obviously, if you don't have access to those opportunities, and that is a network that you can't kind of tap into. So one of my participants is talking about the last recession, so the kind of around the kind of 2008, 2010. I think this is a really interesting kind of point. So he was, he talks about the recession, how it hit the comedy circuit, and everyone got pushed down a level. So like all the people who'd been on multiple weeks once and could potentially have gone on tour, they had to go back to the circuit. People had already been on the circuit, had to go back to local regional club gigs, and all the people that weren't doing that had to go back to doing like mental rather than headlining. So there's this real kind of push where people's conditions are squeezed quite kind of people have to kind of move a step back down the ladder. And I think we'll see a similar thing kind of post-pandemic, where there will be kind of a kind of a push where people will find it harder. And another from the same person who talks about the experience of deciding that they couldn't afford to go to a gig because of the money that was being offered compared to the amount of, compared to kind of the cost of getting there. And he talks about this, being offered this by a promoter and saying it was a reliability test. The idea that there would be more to come if he'd said yes. But then he says, oh, I literally couldn't afford it. I literally could not afford to go and do that gig for 100 quid. Whereas if you've got other paid work, which at the time I did not, that becomes less of an issue. And you go, yeah, fine, I can write that off by doing this gig on Tuesday or Thursday or whatever. But on my other gigs, right, either unpaid or like 20 quid or 50 quid or whatever at that moment. So the idea that, your commitment to the industry, your commitment to your kind of craft is relying on your ability to kind of not earn any money. Obviously, that is incredibly, we can see how that becomes very classist very quickly because, not everyone has access to those resources. And Brooke in their book talks about this quite a lot. And, for women, people of colour, those from working class origins, we will see earlier exits from cultural labour markets than otherwise have happened. And again, during COVID, we've seen this a lot. So Rachel Healy's done some really interesting work, and she does some interviews with some comedians and to kind of talk about how their experience during the pandemic. So she talks to Jacob Hawley, who says, when I started doing stand-up, I was working in retail and all I ever wanted to do was stop because I didn't feel like a real comedian. There's a massive amount of shame around that in comedy that will have to change. Because it's going to be a long time until people can make a living out of performance again. And then Lauren Person, who's a comedian based in the North East, and during the pandemic, I got a job in a supermarket. She says it's easy to think, how did they climb the ladder so quickly? Maybe they didn't have to work a day job. So of course they're going to get seen more and get better quicker. If more people were transparent about help they'd had, it would take the pressure off everyone. And then Paul Flanagan, who has spent most of the pandemic and previous to that working as a care worker, has said, I would love to have a look at everyone comedians' parents' bank account. Privilege is a huge thing in comedy. It creates a two-tier system. The ones who have financial resources can get ahead. So in general, we think about privilege. The industry privileges those with disposable income, or those who are either time rich or have flexible employment. There's no guarantee of return on investment, and it's really difficult to make a leap to longer shows that will go to the fringe if you can't afford to be there. And obviously, precarity is easy to manage for those without other responsibilities, so potentially it has a greater impact on those their parents and particularly women. So in terms of the future then, I think there are a lot of things that we consider. There's things like the Arts Council funding. I think that would be a start, but I think there is also questions about who would get that funding and whether that would just perpetuate kind of inequalities. Initiatives support comedians to go to Edinburgh. One of the things that I think the Live Comedy Association's kind of helped with is a code of practice for pay and conditions. So unionisation, essentially. It's not an industry that's historically been unionised very well. You can join equity, but most people don't. And there's also been some discussion of having like a kind of independent HR for the industry. But again, that's at very early stages. So thank you. I do realise that was a lot very quickly. So if people have questions, I'm really happy to answer them at the end. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Claire. I think we will take the question for the end of the flat session to give space to the presentation. So now welcome Jack. Jack is studying his PhD in philosophy and religions at the University of Wales. His focus is primarily upon allegory and applied ethics using the lens of fantasy to explore ethical issues. He has presented his model in different conferences and papers and about philosophy, religion, and ethics. Welcome, Jack.
Hello, just checking. Audio and video is all right with everyone?
Yes.
Excellent. So, it's going to be a roller coaster this one. We're going to start with talking about zombified ants, going to get all the way to swords and sorcery, and then late stage capitalism and high-fiving Karl Marx. So let's get on the move. So there is, through cultural osmosis, most people have learned about something called the cordyceps fungus. It's this little parasite, this little fungiform that burrows its way into the brain of an ant. It gets in there, it worms its way in, and quietly, slowly, and remarkably quickly, it slowly reorients the ant's brain chemistry so that the ant then does what the parasite wishes it to do. And eventually the ant is devoured by the parasite and its fungal spores jettison out of the ant's head and flutter off to infect more ants. The ant doesn't know that its mind has been quite literally changed, but it has, and that's part of the point. We'll get back to that. Hopping to our world, far removed from the Amazon. I don't know how far removed from the Amazon all of our attendees are, but I think it's safe to assume that the closest I've ever been to a jungle is a zoo, or failing that, the tube on a Friday night. Now, it's a simple fact that money in our world may not be able to buy happiness, but what it can buy is security. Health, for example, even in the most minute and cosmetic of forms, requires money changing hands. Medicines, first aid kits, good food. But the individual working as a hospital porter, well, they may live each day surrounded by these same mechanisms to prolong life and improve general health. But the CEO of the fast food corporation across the street from the porter's house is undoubtedly going to live a life longer and healthier than he who may be subjected to the smog of the city and the depressing, affordable ramen noodles the salary of a porter mandates living upon to survive and still pay rent. Indeed, one may note that though the CEO produces nothing, they are rewarded with the health and longevity that the porter can never hope to achieve due to his economic status. And why? Well, to examine this, we can look at fantasy. Fantasy is that little escape which can't be locked off. No one can take your imagination. Whilst many a philosopher echoes the plaintive cry of Rousseau, oh, man is born free and everywhere is in chains, even those who acknowledge that whatever constraints tie down our physical bodies don't rarely, or at least very rarely, fully tie down the mind. And they allow that mind to soar beyond the mundane, into realms where it can flourish and explore worlds of imagination without the ties of responsibilities and or material attachment. You don't need to worry about your bills when you are Grogback the Barbarian. Now, one such outlet is games like Dungeons and Dragons, something I personally love. It's a popular tabletop role-playing game. You have pens, you have paper, and you play in your imagination. It allows the player to assume the role of a heroic figure sometimes a villainous, but regardless, they're always working to improve themselves, to get stronger, to attain their goals. Goals which, given time, are indeed likely to be achievable with magical powers and feats of skill a player character is capable of, as a character perhaps totally unlike the player's own personality. Here, anyone can become a powerful wizard capable of bending reality, a paladin sworn to holy duty, or a cleric whose faith grants them powers which some may even call messianic, or, if you want, just a wall of muscle because I've got noodle arms. With just a sheet of paper and imagination, you can get to that fantasy. However, fantasy is a mirror to our world. Despite our efforts, a trace of the true self always remains in the false self, and the extent of the freedoms we allow our Dungeons and Dragons characters is often restricted by the subconscious need to implant reality into a world of comforting illusions, which was indeed once free of the stresses and problems of reality. And in our fantasies, we're followed by the same oppressive systems which keep those down on their luck down, and those who exploit the former group on the rise. This is how the adventurer economy works and how player characters fit into it. Now, the adventurer, your adventurer is an everyman. He's a hard worker. She is someone who takes dangerous quests on, some of which can eventually be fatal undertakings of any variety. One way to think of the adventurer is to consider them essential workers akin to doctors or farmers, albeit workers whose existence is a core pillar supporting not a society, but a universe, wherein the supernatural runs riot and deadly threats at such regular frequency appear as we see in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. Players of the game, in pursuit of that solace and escape granted by odysseys into the fantastical, become one of the scores of adventurers facing up such foes of the civilized world. And the wheel turns anew. The fresh blood runs cold with iron. The worker is again a cog in the capitalist machine, turning not simply for profit, but for the survival of the world and all worlds surrounding it, or at least that is what we hear. Here's the ultimate end of the adventurer economy. It's the absurd extrapolation of the very same world in which we live and its economic system, but gone are the nurses, absent are the firefighters or shop assistants, whose lives are risked for that great leviathan of economic stability. In their place sit the adventurers, slayers of dragons, masters of magics, takers of thieves, they who explore yet unknown horizons for the safety of those who follow along the trails they blaze. But rather than welcome deserving heroes to meet them upon their return from such arduous quests, there is instead commodification and exploitation. A fictional watchman puts this best. The reason that the rich are so rich is because they manage to spend less money. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that would still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, whilst the poor man who could only afford cheap boots will have spent $100 in the same time, and that would still have wet feet. And it's the curse of adventurer. It's the curse of the adventurer. To be laid low not by a monster, but by high prices. The primary gameplay loop of any RPG, pen and paper or otherwise, is for the players to raise their levels of power and confront more of the deadly threats that face the world in which they live. The same cycle which their characters are ensnared in. To live as an adventurer, one must travel. Therefore, permanent residence is rare. Inns are a staple, and there is a constant stream of money to those who rely upon the travelling heroes for revenue, as is the nature of the hospitality sector. And with each new call to adventure comes fresh meat for the merchants of Dungeons and Dragons to tear into with their commercial, nous, and hypothetical, and sometimes literal fangs. We characterize our society as free, but prominent philosophy takes care to assure us that wherever man goes, the social contracts within which we are cocooned in the modern day keeps in the same chains that Rousseau spoke of several centuries before the first Dungeons and Dragons book was ever published. We in the modern day, we idolaters of late-stage capitalism, are ensnared in much the same vicious cycle that besets the erstwhile adventurer. Rinse, repeat, return to rinse. The adventurer economy is thus. An adventurer becomes an adventurer to earn the gold other professions do not offer because they need to pay for their existence, and is then hit by repeated costs to not only keep them indebted to those who market themselves as providers of services, but also to keep them as an adventurer until they escape the cycle, should it even be possible to do so. For example, the humble inn. Adventurers are by nature nomadic, as they must go where there are problems and dragons cannot be trusted. The inconsiderate sons of, well, to have the courtesy to attend the back garden of the dragon slayer when needed. Thus, they need to find shelter in other avenues. The adventurer must pursue things other than personal domiciles, and this eschews the mantle of citizenship for the promise of financial support, namely the inns and taverns they frequent. Lacking a kitchen in which to prepare food, the service and restaurant industries are further supported by the adventurers, who require aid to have sustenance, paying nightly bills to innkeepers and twice daily purchasing food from purveyors of such. The coffers of the adventurer are likely to run dry. When their coffers run dry, they must continue adventuring, paying other vendors of equipment and weaponry in order to survive their next debt-mandated jaunt into a dungeon or cave filled with pesky vermin. And here we witness the seed take root and then grow into a blooming Venus flytrap, as the adventurer is no longer fighting for whatever cause they began their journey to support. Not Truly, as we see that it becomes man's fate to contribute to the growth of the economic system, to amass capital, not for his own purposes of happiness or salvation, but as an end in itself. The original goals are subsumed by the human drive for survival, as the quest to defeat the dragon is then monopolized by and forgotten thanks to the mundane quests for food, for shelter, for gear to ensure survival, a steady stream of income, and for the next job to get the job after that. Yes, one can conceive that the final goal of defeating the dragon is indeed ever present. That dragon's always there, and in the world of Dungeons and Dragons, that dragon is fundamentally empirically real. But it's not immediate, not the base needs of any given individual that you may choose to name. Furthermore, it's only the adventuring class who see no benefit and the prejudices of being the target demographic of most vendors. The citizen class have political sway, permanent residence, no need to mainline their wealth into the pockets of restaurateurs, hoteliers, and merchants offering the amenities and supplies required to live the life of an adventurer. What use does a subsistence farmer have for a flaming longsword? Why would a cartwright ever need to purchase meals when his vegetable garden is free to harvest? The answer is that they clearly would not. The common man is weaker than the adventurer physically and magically, but holds more political and fiscal sway than even the mightiest of monster hunters. Whereas the adventurer is forever poor, this is due to the society around them being constructed solely around their exploitation, despite the fact that they are essential. The Marxist dichotomy between proletariat and bourgeoisie is one which applies here quite clearly. The dragons of this world are not pandemics, they're not domestic terrorists or climate change. The monsters of Dungeons and Dragons are indeed real, corporeal, except in some cases where they are terrifyingly incorporeal, threats, which without hyperbole are monsters. But the force fighting against them, the first, last, and all the lines of defense in the middle that the multiverse has are the taxed workers who are reduced to cash cows when no threat is looming large. Whatever rewards the adventurer reaps for their work fending off these threats is nothing compared to what they spend to remain in their profession as adventurer, a singular hourglass of sand in the rushing sandstorm of money they've spent just to exist. The system is designed to revolve around the custom the adventurers bring in, to be defended by them, as of course in the medieval world, domestic troops and standing armies are used exclusively for metropolitan policing and conflicts between nobles, their families, and their rivals, as well as the fact that regular wages are significantly more costly than commissioned adventurers once in a while. So when the society operates this way, it's threatened to constantly produce more adventurers through romanticizing their struggles and propagandizing their earnings. It's no mean feat to churn out adventurers at much the same rate as they expire, with the adventurer economy proving that much of the time the laws and rules which officials attempt to inflict upon the poor are non-functional in relation to their status in society. The officials are blind to the fact that people should not respect rules that are not serving them, but whilst the rules apply to adventurers, they hold no means to sway those laws. They are not citizens, they have no domicile, they have no status as a citizen. They are travelers, they are nomadic, they are heroes, but they are not heroes given any kind of recognition. To attempt to reach for that political maneuverability and that would be sufficient to change this system is to exclude oneself from the adventuring class and benefit from the adventure economy system, thus causing the cost of change to rise dramatically because it is now personal. They who once suffered are now in control, and no longer do they see a need for change when the systems changing will cost them the power others once had over them. You have a choice. You can either be the ant or you can be the parasite. You can be that cordyceps mushroom burrowing deep, but if you choose to be, you don't want the ants to find out you're doing what you're doing because you don't know what would happen. What would happen, do you think, when the ant finds out that a parasite in its brain is making it do things for it that do not benefit the ant, but benefit the parasite? Would the ant then do them? The answer is fairly obvious. The changing and exchanging of power is constant, but the society never changes too dramatically. That is merely the way it always has been. Adventurers have always been the linchpin of the multiverse in Dungeons and Dragons, ever vigilant guards of reality itself for naught but fortune and glory. They who are in charge have always been trying to remain in charge and maintain or achieve a status quo which enables the continuance of their abuses of status, power, and the system they exist within. The reason they are able to do so is simple. Those within the system have existed within it for so long that anything other than the punitive, exploitative society that they have seems simply unnatural to them. This term has actually been coined capitalist realism in a book of the same name, owing its existence to a quote attributed to both Slavoj Žižek, everyone's favorite cuddly Marxist, and Frederick Jameson, who is less cuddly and possibly less unhinged. A famous adage that that bemoans the fact that it is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. And it's a perfect descriptor of the adventurer economy, as the risk of a lack of adventurers to feed into various gaping maws to fend off catastrophe after catastrophe is in itself catastrophic. Much of the threats the adventuring class dare to face to ensure the safety of others in the citizen class are world-ending. But thanks to the adventure economy in place, which ensures that whatever gains are made by the adventurers are for nothing, well, whilst they may have physical and magical prowess lacked by the common populace, there's a distinct divide between them and they who control the system in which they live. We saw this with the pandemic as well. During the pandemic, I bet everyone knows someone who was an essential worker. You may yourselves have been an essential worker. I have plenty of friends who worked tirelessly. I knew a lot of friends on a nursing degree. I myself knew people who worked at the local supermarket and feared for their lives every single day, and nothing was done about it. There was clapping, but clapping does not pay bills. And it is the same. It is as if they were adventurers fighting some great dragon thrown into its maw only to be cast aside. Your problem is not that the problem is there. The problem is the system in which the problem is happening. The issue becomes that, well, let's put it this way. If there is a dragon that you have to fight, and your options are either spend a lot of your money training and ensuring that your armies are fully weaponized, ready not to fight against the petty land disputes, but instead against an inhuman monster from beyond the stars. Or you could send these homeless people who are forced to keep fighting monsters because you have designed a system that keeps them ground down. A bus ticket costs £4 for a day rider where I live. £4.60. That's an hour of work at the most minimum wage job. No matter how hard you try, you're always going to have the problem that in order to get a job interview, you need a suit. In order to get a suit, you need money. In order to get money, you need a job interview. Therefore, you cannot get a job interview without money. You cannot get money without a job. And you cannot get a job without a job interview. The problem is cyclical. It's the adventurer economy all over again. Now, you could argue that I'm being a bit silly, that I am likening a conflict in a world where dragons exist and the gods are empirical. But no, this is merely the ex absurdum argument. I have taken a problem we are having and I have merely taken it to a form which is more absurd. It's blown up bigger, not to ridicule the issue, not to try and bend something into shape, but instead to be able to see the minutiae of the problem. And the minutiae of the problem is that the system is inherently broken. We have been goaded, coached into seeing that capitalism is not just the only viable solution to an economic problem, but it is that it is the only solution. We're trying to think outside the box, but we can only think outside the box in terms of another box. We have been in capitalism so long. The adventurers have been in the system for so long. Is that, well, the problem then becomes you can only think of the system in terms of the system. So, my question to you is, when you think about it, who do you want to be? Do you want to be the ant? Or do you want to be the parasite? I think that's me done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very interesting, a brilliant presentation. You have a lot of comment and a lot of positive comment. So I'll invite you to read your nice comment. So we will back for a question in the end. Now I have the need to welcome Andy. So Andy is a teacher and still works with young people in school, and is writing a LED project with comics relief. He's best known as creator of outstanding teaching intervention that I invite you to explore. It sounds very interesting. Andy has been a prolific trainer with an excellent reputation in training courses. So welcome, Andy, and thanks for the presentation.
Thanks, Maria. Can you just check, can you see my screen, Maria? Is that good? Does it work?
Great.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'll get straight in. My presentation is going to be around why your organisation should adopt a dynamic definition of social justice. I'm going to look at the best way, in my opinion, to influence others so they spend a little bit more time on this issue, and what practical things we can do now. If you work in education, I hope you find this interesting. If you're a parent or grandparent too, and I've structured this so that there's something there for leaders, teachers, teaching assistants, a variety of different people. So a little bit about my background. I went to University of Manchester. I'm from originally a place called Edmonton in North London. After my original parents divorced, we were homeless for a spell, and I lived in some flats in Edmonton for about 8-9 years. I often joke my real father's a magician. He did a disappearing act when I was 8 years old, and I haven't seen him since. But that whole experience of homelessness was really, really big in terms of my life and being born up in poverty. One of the proudest days of my mum's life, and that's my stepdad there, Emerson, was the day I graduated. A lot of the time at university, I did feel like a fish out of water. I was pretty good at football, ended up being the captain of the university football team, and that sort of sustained me to a large period of time. But all the way through O-levels and A-levels, I did sort of summer jobs like hospital portering, road sweeping. I did one of my A-levels at night school, and I'm just very grateful for anybody who helped me on that journey, the NHS, the people who gave me a full grant, and mostly to my mum, who had to leave school at 15, desperately wanted to stay on for O-levels. But she always took me to library, and for those of you old enough to remember, brought home magazines like World of Wonder and Look and Learn, and it just made me the person I am today, I guess. So when I went to university, I started hand-me-down clothes, you know, even underwear for my cousin. She wasn't even my size, actually. Slight joke, but I had my cousin Ian's underwear. So what I did, I left university, I became a secondary school teacher. I had a few things published while I was a teacher, and then I left full-time teaching 20 years ago. And I've written a couple of best-selling books in education, and a lot of people say a lot of nice things about them, and they're the basis of a national franchise that I created called the Outstanding Teaching Intervention, where I've trained and quality assured quite a lot of fantastic trainers who go into schools around the UK. So what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation actually is my experience about how you sort of like influence people really to adopt these sort of more dynamic definitions. So why should we adapt a dynamic definition of social justice? Well, first of all, notice I'm using the term social justice. I'm not going to be using the term social mobility, which carries with it the implication that there's something wrong with being working class. Being working class is something you should get out of, and then you can become successful. So the definition I like to use comes from Professor John West Burnham, and I looked around a lot for different definitions. But social justice, to get equality and equity, requires deliberate and specific interventions. Now, I really want us to focus on that through this presentation, because that for me is crucial, that it's not just something that sits somewhere on the document, but it's a living and breathing set of practices that we apply. So my last book, surprisingly, won Business Book of the Year in 2019. And I'm now doing work with organisations outside education, a large council, a few other organisations I can't mention, but they are struggling in a good way to try to get organisations for everybody is a better learner. So I believe that learning is a great vehicle for that. So I want to share that I've been training adults now for over 20 years. I want to share a little bit of learning about that. And if we're serious about influencing people to take social justice more seriously, then I think we need to recognise certain truths. And the first truth that was taught to me by a woman called Professor Anna Kraft at my very first conference, probably back in about 1999. I don't know if anybody remembers overhead projectors and acetates, but I was knees knocking, getting up to stand up and do a presentation. And she said, you're going to meet on your journey omnivores, grazers, and no-eaters. Now, omnivores are people that are enthusiastic to learn. They're already probably interested in social justice and already active in this area. Grazers are good people, but they require pressure to do anything. And no-eaters, however good your argument is, won't eat anything at all. Now, my learning is that in most organisations, the vast majority of people are grazers. The vast majority of people, therefore, need pressure to learn. And then when you've given them that pressure, which may be uncomfortable at the time, a few years later, they're grateful for that because they've become much higher quality professionals, much more knowledgeable, etc. So one of the arguments I would use with a grazer to get them more interested in social justice is the waste argument. Sonia Blandford talks about this in her book, Born to Fail, that we are wasting as an economy 77 billion pounds a year on what is sometimes called the forgotten third. So you'll be aware, if you're in the education system, that about a third of children don't really go through and pass the system. They don't get at least a grade 4 in GCSE English and maths. I think that's an absolute fucking disgrace. I think that the system a long time has been rigged against a lot of people, and the waste argument could be a way to get more people who are not naturally inclined to be looking at closing gaps for people from who may not even be in their same class to adopt. Equally, the argument of, you know, if it weakens one of us, it weakens all of us, is something that can help to influence a grazer. Also think that schools, I think a revolution's on the way. And there's so much literature in the education world at the moment about how we assess children. And I think it's pretty clear that the consensus is that we assess children very narrowly, and we assess them in the internet world using a pen and paper predominantly. So what I would urge you to do is to try to get your organisation to constantly ask questions. What are we doing? What is the purpose of our organisation? I really love this book called Thrive. I heard Amelia Peterson do a podcast recently about this, and I just love this book. But what's great about this is she talks about sort of the 4 levels, starting really with the planetary global level. How can we get the world to thrive? you know, when we know that climate change is a real pressing issue? How can we get a thriving society, which changes the narrative to what it was in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher says there is no such thing as society? How can we get interpersonal relationships to thrive? I mean, we are at the moment a country just at each other's throats, aren't we? So this debate is absolutely crucial. And then how do we get individuals to thrive, to learn happiness from the inside out? And I tell you now, if you're not working in schools, anxiety is a big issue for young people in this country. And surveys of young people suggest that in the UK, we're not only failing more people than other countries of equivalent income in terms of not passing exams, but a lot of our young people are very unhappy too. Another book which I think would be really great to press to senior leaders in your school, if you are a senior leader, you know, perhaps we can set up a reading group or something like this, comes from Dr. Lucy Maynard and Dr. Kaz Stewart, who I interviewed on my Community Talks podcast series, little plug there. They talk about the equalities literacy framework as being a great thing to adopt. I ask you guys, where in the curriculum is there the balance of how we assess learners? Where do we assess someone's own journey of distance travelled? Does everything has to be quantitative and assessed externally? That doesn't happen in some blue chip companies I work with. Some companies I work with who in the FTSE top 100 actually take a lot of interest in their employees' lived experience of where they want to go next. Where do they want to be developed? So we're really falling behind the times here in education. And these two books could possibly be a way to change the narrative of our organisation, because I think many secondary schools in particular become like exam factories. And as much as I agree, and there'll be lots of people in the next couple of days talking about how we change the system. And the system is classist, the system is racist, the system is structurally very, very flawed. However, I haven't got time to wait for that revolution to come. We've got to do a lot of change now, and we need to bring people with us on that journey, some of whom might not be working class or might not be from working class origins. I think it's really important that we don't shut down people and shout people down and label people just because perhaps they haven't had homelessness in their lives. They haven't had challenges to do with poverty. Perhaps they haven't had the level of empathy that comes from those experiences. So when I'm presenting to an audience or when I'm talking to anybody or when I'm writing, I always think, what do I want my audience to think, feel and do? And if I want to, and that's the key thing to do, if I want to adopt a more dynamic social justice definition, what I need to do is present to them with warmth, subtlety, humour, not to shut them down. They need to have dialogue, not worry if they're talking to me and use the wrong phrase and that type of thing, because that to me is a key part of how we sort of build that sort of coalition for change. So on to what we can practically do. Well, let's talk about schools and colleges first of all. So currently I've been self-employed for over 20 years and I have a mixed economy of working with young people and working with schools and working with other organisations. Let's start with schools and colleges first. So if you're in one of these, that could help. I've just noticed I've spelled the word balance wrong, but you know, please forgive me. To create more balanced assessment practices, which I've said something about already, but can we think about how we might do that? So there's a really good organisation called Rethinking Assessment that's doing a lot of work on this at the moment. They are looking for people to actively set up pilots, particularly around maybe the measure of things like soft skills, more qualitative type of assessments. So I would really urge you to think about doing that. As a personality, I'm a bit of a ready, fire, aim guy. I'm not too worried about failure because what is it? It's if you're not taking risks, you're not trying things. So I'll share with you in a minute something that I've set up that you might be interested in. The second one is staff reallocation. Within a school, my view should be that the best teachers, the high performers, most effective, should be working with your learners who have the most challenges. If you are, many schools now are going into MATs, multi-academy trusts, or parts of chains. And sadly, schools are still measured by league tables, and those league tables predominantly are just looking at one thing, which are exams. But wouldn't it be great if some head teachers or some CEOs of MATs were brave enough to actually reallocate from their more affluent schools or their more proficient schools to some of the schools that were being challenged the most? The next area is manifestos, or what I call sparking experiences. My favourite manifesto, if you haven't read it, it comes from Mark Thomas, The People's Manifesto, where he went around the country as a Radio 4 programme and got people to suggest laws that should be adopted, such as, I think, if people let their dog shit without picking it up, they should be forced to wear the shitter's moustache, and etc., which is great. But actually, I love going into schools where there's a conscious attempt to give pupils a range of experiences before they leave. So they see it as an entitlement. They see it as, this is from Evelyn Community Primary School in Knowsley, in Merseyside, where there's a range of different things they will have and experience. So I'm a great believer in what you call sparking experiences. When I first started working with Comic Relief, working with excluded youngsters, we would do a lot of taking kids on Outward Bounds courses, and I'm a great believer in getting them to reflect at the end of a course. I love journaling. I like getting students to journal. And I like training students to present their journeys and where they're going next. For a start, it means that we listen to them. But many of those young people, this is from Hackney, North London, had never left London before. So I think it's really important that we think about that as an entitlement for students. I've set up something called a Mallet Scholars Programme. There are alternative programs available to get children to think about going to university, such as the Brilliant Club, which I find a little bit elitist, in all honesty. And I've set this up now, and it's running in 4 different schools. I present it. I'm getting some Ph.D. Someone's going to do a PhD based on the learning so far, but students are getting extra GCSEs through this, and that they're getting better results. That's been sort of proven over 3 years, even before teacher assessed grades. And the evaluations from the students and the parents have been very, very strong. So let me just talk about and show you how that works. So why I think this is a really good course for students is that I give them career knowledge about how certain careers and industries work. We do a lot of training around emotional knowledge, sort of techniques to become less anxious, manage your inner chimp, Steve Peters' work. We're very strong on academic knowledge. There's loads of reading built into this. So students who start this course in year 7 leave in year 11, leave with 15. So they are bought 15 books on this course that they will read as part of the course, such as Picture of Dorian Gray and others. But also, interestingly, I teach them a lot about what I call system knowledge. The schools I'm running this are in very high working class areas. And one of the things that Ofsted are looking for at the moment is for schools to teach something called cultural capital, which is sometimes been said by them in their literature to introduce students to the best that have been thought and said. I'd urge you to read Phil Beadle's book on this, The Fascist Painting, who says it far better than I can. But the idea behind cultural capital from Ofsted and from the government is to look at knowledge and look at what they sometimes called high arts as being somehow superior to other arts. So there's a deliberate attempt here to actually lionize one form of culture over another. What they've done, though, Ofsted, is made a massive flaw and a massive mistake, that they've used a language of cultural capital, which is the language which comes from Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, whereas really they should be using the language of cultural literacy, which gives us a massive opportunity. And if we are charged with forming a cultural curriculum, we've really got three choices. Do we give the poor the culture of the rich, which is, I think, what the government and Ofsted are sort of doing, really? But that's really to me, that's a social mobility approach. And then there's an educationalist called David Cameron, not the other disastrous former Prime Minister, who talks about this being the Trojan horse for inequality. Do we reject legitimate culture and just say to working class children and families, look, just going to live your life as working class people, or do we go to a curriculum which has greater access to all sorts of different aspects of the arts, but there is a plurality of knowledge that is being learned? And that's what I'm trying to do on the Scholars Programme. So another thing you can do practically to get more social justice in your organisation is to actually rethink how you teach cultural literacy, cultural capital in your school. And actually to teach this without teaching about Bourdieu is indefensible. So this gives us a massive opportunity to teach pupils about this. The other thing I would say too is that my programme works with the parents of the children, and the attendance rates of parents in my sessions during lockdown, where predominantly I'm working in places like Kirby, in Bootle and Merseyside, and the schools are about 70% plus pupil premium. The attendance was absolutely stunning. Okay, so parents are accessing perhaps a presentation on their phones or whatever, but I'm presenting to them information that I'm presenting to their children as well, talking to them about the books that they're reading and all the other sort of modules on the course. So if you want to find out a bit more about that, please get in touch. So I think there's a great opportunity here to, and if you work in a mainly middle class setting as an educator, please, have some respect and teach people about working class art. I was privileged to go to the Ashlington gallery where former coal miners, that's the picture on the bottom right there, did their paintings. You ever get a chance to go, guys, it's fantastic. I don't know if there's an online version. But to me, even in the arts, there's been a lot more privileged people taking over. If you watch Claire Sedgewick's presentation at the beginning, you'll see that even in stand-up comedy, it's just harder now for working class people to get through. But partly, I think that's because that they're somehow being taught that their culture or their talent is somehow less than others. And what Bourdieu teaches us is that we don't live in a meritocracy. And I think we should teach that to kids fairly and thoroughly. Finally, in terms of practical things, well, what about if you're here and you work for a university or business or other organisation? Well, first of all, can we do a bit better track and tracing? Lots of organisations have social clustering. And can we make sure that it's not just the same people all the time? Look at corporate responsibility, effective altruism as a potential opportunity. And can we have a look at if your organisation does internships, can they be paid? Are they advertised? Or is it just people with connections getting them? There's an opportunity also to partner with social justice organisations so that it's not just the same people getting into the same professions, because the data is damning for professions like the law and medicine and media. So some really good work there about Amaraja from Bristol University, what sort of things we can be doing as organisations. I'll stick the link in the presentation. And finally, if even organisations like Sky Sports can link with social justice organisations such as Kick It Out for racism, then there's hope for everybody. So I hope there's something in that for you there, guys. I'll leave you with a bit of James Baldwin, if that's okay. It began to seem that one would have to hold in mind forever two ideas which seemed to be in opposition. The first idea was acceptance. The acceptance totally about rancour, that life as it is, and that men as they are. In the light of this idea, it goes without saying that justice is commonplace. But this did not mean that one could not be complacent. But the second idea was one of equal power, that one should never in one's life accept these injustices as commonplace, but one must fight them with all one's strength. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you so much, Andy. So we have to move to the last presentation. Now we welcome Aidan for the fourth presentation. So Aidan is a composer, a doctoral researcher, is exploring the creative potential and embodying a working classness in the new interdisciplinary music composition. He received several awards and invite also to explore his podcast, What is Your Working Class? So welcome, Aidan.
Hi, everyone. As I said, I'm Aidan Teplitzky. I'm a composer and doctoral researcher from working class background. And today I want to talk about one of my pieces and the idea of affect as a way of approaching how to embody working classness in new music. So I want to start off by talking about the issues of stereotyping, in that there's been a number of cases of misrepresentation of working classness in the media, such as in documentaries such as Benefit Street by Channel 4, and the use of working class aesthetics in the fashion industry that can be seen in the series Models, Street to Catwalk. Now, in approaching this concern, the concept of affect provides a useful point of entry. Affect can be understood as being the emotional meaning given to objects, experiences, or places over time, such as inherited jewelry embodying memories of a family member, or the marks on an old jacket signifying previous hard work and enjoyment of graft. Now, the sociologist Beverly Skeggs connects this idea of how affect can be used to understand working classness in her concept of person value. Now, person value considers how affect can enable the working classes to form a sense of identity by focusing on the individual meaning given to various objects, experiences, and places, rather than the value given to these things by others. So centering value-based judgments on the personal subjective value of them, rather than their possible exchange value. And so by approaching working classes through considerations of affect, I am able to avoid perpetuating stereotypes through a greater contextualization of the meaning or the ways of being of these working class things in representing working classness in my outputs. So I'm going to play you one of my pieces, and it's called Dash, 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 which will make sense when you see the piece. And in the piece, I want to examine the affectual meaning given to swearing by the working classes and the issues of upper and middle class people and organizations failing to recognize these hidden meanings. Now, in approaching affect, the work develops through the gift of attention over time by having the musical and text elements become denser and become deeper in order to explore how swearing is used by the working class. How swearing is used by the working classes. And the music does this through the layering of additional tones and complexity in the drum part before changing to have the density come through providing more subtle changes in the texture of the music. And the text does this through the deepening understanding developed through the examples given and how the meaning of these examples is repeated and developed throughout the piece. And now I'm going to play the piece for you. One sec. I wasn't too sure whether I should actually write this piece, because a big part of it is that I don't want to over-explain what it is about. And that seems kind of counterintuitive if you're going to write a piece about something. But then there's the problem that people don't get why it is so important to the working classes, and that its use has a greater effectual value than how it is used by the middle or upper classes. Of course, I'm being a bit simplistic here and generalizing, But I don't think that takes away from the fact that the working classness of it isn't understood. Or maybe it's better to say it's misunderstood. And maybe I am overthinking it and giving some greater significance to it than is necessary. But I don't think so. So this is an attempt to explain it in as direct a way as possible, where I managed to describe it in a way that gives the working classness of it, without making it so you need to be working class to get it, while also not providing a middle or upper class representation of the subject, as a way of dumbing down the complexity of it to suit the typical audience for a piece of new music, and thereby making it no longer working class. I might have already messed up by using unfamiliar language, but then that's kind of the point of the piece. How to explain something so that you get it without feeling talked down to, and to deal with the idea of intelligence, or the perception of intelligence, between the working, middle, and upper classes, and that there is some kind of inherent betterness between the three. So I think I've done enough of a contrasting introduction. So, this is a piece about swearing. Now, I want to be clear about what kind of swearing I'm going to be talking about. I'm not going to deal with slurs because each has its own baggage and I can't be fucked going into the nuance of them. Even though I frequently say faggot and cunt because sometimes someone or something is being a faggot or being a cunt or being a faggy cunt or a cunty faggot. And it's hard to describe what exactly is making them be these things, but I'm sure when I said faggot, cunt, and faggy cunt or cunty faggot, you came up with a pretty decent idea of why you would say that about someone or something that has nothing to do with a gay man or a woman's genitalia. But that doesn't mean the history goes away, so I'm leaving them for another time. I'm also going to focus on swearing being used to describe something negatively. The reason for this is because even though you get positive uses, the negative is the more familiar. And I also think if I tried to include positive and negative uses of swearing, it would mean dealing with the issue of the middle and upper classes failing to recognise working class expressions of emotion. For example, of perceiving passion as aggression. And that is a whole other piece. So I'm going to focus on fuck. The reason for this is because it's the main word we reach for when something gets to that point of intensity. To give an example, I'm already sick of this fucking microphone. Now, you don't know why this specific microphone is being a fucking microphone, but it's probably got something to do with the faff, the fucking positioning, how to make sure the spit guard is set right so I don't have to spend ages on fucking editing, the general fucking nightmare of technology, of fucking wires, is the recording fucking working, background fucking noise, and so on. But there's also the history of how fucking annoying this microphone has been. The previous times it's been a fucking pain. My own annoyance at having the same fucking mistakes using this fucking thing. The frustration of not learning how to avoid the same fucking problems. The fact some problems you cannot prepare for and will continue to fuck you over. And that I know there are going to be more problems in the fucking future that I can't do anything about. So when I say fuck, I'm giving you the past, present, and future of this microphone's hassle, but in such a way so as to not waste your fucking time. Because I know how unimportant this fucking microphone is in the grand scheme of things, so I'm just chucking the boring stuff out there so I can get to the fucking point. Really quite respectful, isn't it? Because what I'm doing is censoring the boring shit for your benefit. Because you know, and I know, that we have better things to be doing than expressing our deep feelings over something so fucking insignificant. and that even though there are a lot of deeper reasons behind why I'm finding this microphone to be a fucking pain, I'm mostly saying fuck to get it out of the way and get to the point. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but the way I've been swearing hasn't been very effective. What I mean is that it's not been finely crafted like some bit from the thick of it, where the swearing is like an accent in a piece of music. So, as a result, me saying fuck so often has made it become boring. Mostly because you've gotten familiar to me saying it. And also you might have related it to people who only seem to swear. People that are called Neds or Chavs depending on your geographical location. Which may have made you hostile because you might not be comfortable with being too familiar with that kind of culture. But see, there's a very good reason for this overuse of fuck. And that's to do with a whole number of things. Because, like with my fucking microphone, there are problems such as not having enough fucking food, money continuing to be fucking tight because there aren't any decent fucking jobs, job support and universal credit only just making ends fucking meet, pretentious cunts looking at you like you're fucking worthless, your past being fucking hard and how your present isn't any fucking better, not having any free fucking time because of the inhuman demands put on you, and that whenever you try to solve the issue you get fucking nowhere because of stupid fucks who don't fucking get it, leaving you to try and deal with these fucking problems hanging over you. But I'm sure we all agree these things aren't anything like my fucking microphone, but again it's a case of repetition, of knowing that these problems are going to be past, present and future. Some people are so used to such an abysmal state of fucking existence, the only solution is to try and condense the fucking bullshit down to keep on going because they know it ain't getting better anytime soon. So we'll have people saying fucking this, fucking that, because the problems of whatever fucking thing is causing grief in that moment of time are just another part of the fucking hassle that is the majority of their lives. So they can get to whatever fucking point they have to get to on that day. But in this act of condensing the bullshit of the day-to-day bollocks down into an endless stream of fucks, there is the argument that you are minimising the importance of these issues and playing an active role in making your life insignificant. Or because you aren't talking about these problems in such a way that the people who could help can understand, they are put off because they don't want to be too familiar with that kind of culture. And by censoring the bullshit of your life, you're given a free pass for people to let it keep on happening. But the issue is that swearing is seen as an attack on hierarchies, and in attempting to censor swearing itself through mutilating the printed word by substitution or eradication, or the sounded word through an alarm designed to deafen thought, those higher up try to pretend that these words do not exist. Kind of like class. And so, by describing something as fucking, you are disrespecting something that is apparently better than you. Now, ideologies are fucking stupid, and any situation in which someone or something demands respect before you actually engage with it needs to get a fucking grip. That does not mean you go into every situation guns blazing, but that you understand the difference between politeness and respect, and that the excellence of various things is not assumed but made apparent in its actions, and then you can decide to respect them. Of course, you need to remember we all make mistakes, but if these mistakes are so bad and so frequent, then you should describe these failing institutions or persons as fucking shit. But in censoring swearing itself, people and places are demanding they are treated only how they want to be treated, regardless of whether they deserve to be treated that way or not. And that they are spoken to only in the way they believe they should be spoken to, as respected. And that because someone is swearing, they aren't smart enough to be on their level to be worth their time. So, going back to whether you should swear to censor the boring bullshit of your life, and if this is having a negative impact in the long run, it raises the question of why you think these things are insignificant. Again, the issue of repetition. Because if you continue to give ample evidence as to the lack of decent work, government support not being enough to help you improve your life, meritocracy being used to validate keeping the status quo, and nepotism, the continued disrespect and discrimination you are given because you match a stereotype, and the person or organisation that is supposed to be rectifying or addressing these issues doesn't get it and doesn't resolve it, you tend to think the issue is fucking pointless. Because what you are trying to do is to get to the fucking point and not waste time. But for the majority of organisations and people who could be resolving these issues, they get paid regardless of whether they are actually doing their fucking job, so it is worth more to them to fuck around and waste time. Because they have the luxury of time by being paid more per hour and thereby having more free time to not have to worry about getting to the fucking point all the time. And as soon as you describe some injustice as fucking ridiculous to get to the fucking point, it is seen as an attack on this hierarchy, and you are left to just curse and compress the bullshit to fucking oblivion because you wanted to fix the fucking problem now rather than later. And you are left with an understanding that it is your fault your life is this way, that it is personal fault your life is so fucking precarious. Because you decided to get to the fucking point and hope that someone or something will actually deal with their problems that have a negative effect on you. So, what do? You need to remember to be polite and not jump to conclusions, and you need to use swearing the right way, so that you are giving a chance for people or places to do the right thing. And so you can determine your own personal fault in a situation. Don't forget, we all make mistakes. And then, when these things have reached that point of being fucking terrible, and you don't have any personal fault for this being fucking terrible, or when something demands respect from you for no reason, you tell them to fuck off. And hope that this thing will look at themselves, evaluate their actions and why they do them, and determine whether they can improve or whether they should fuck off and let something better that can deal with these issues replace them. They might say fuck you or some fancier way of devaluing your assessment of them. But then you keep on telling them to fuck off until they get the message. Remember, repetition. And hopefully, in this act of treating people like they aren't stupid and capable of critical self-reflection, you can shift from describing something as fucking shit to fucking brilliant. So that the fucking bollocks of the day-to-day is replaced by excellence. You know. cheers, everyone.
Thank you. So we don't have time for questions, sorry. The presentation was very amazing and interesting. A lot of comment in the chat, so I invite all of the presenters to read and enjoy the comment. I would like to thank all of you for the presentation, Claire, Jack, and Aidan. And definitely would like to stay in touch with all of you and hope to have a nice following for the conference. So enjoy, please interact online. So we have to close, sorry. Nice to have you here. Bye-bye.